Good evening. My name is Andy, and this is episode 1 of the Modern Military History Podcast. Today, I'm going to be sharing a few excerpts from a book I have found particularly meaningful. I recently graduated from university. I earned a history degree, and I earned it in 4 years. I am now 22 years old, and although I love history, I'm not quite sure where to go. These last couple months since I graduated, I've been absorbing myself in the study, not only of things I've traditionally appreciated, such as military history, political history, but also a little bit of psychology through the lens of military history. A certain book that ties directly into this recent vein of my thinking has been Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankl. And this book is profound, and I do not want to use that word lightly. It is divided into two sections. First, the autobiographical part of Viktor Frankl's survival of incredibly infamous places, dark names in our history, names like Auschwitz, Dachau, places where hundreds of thousands of people died, murdered by the Nazis. Viktor Frankl survived. And even though he died in 1997, he published more than a score of books on theoretical and clinical psychology. His book, Man's Search for Meaning, remains one of the most pivotal accounts of the Holocaust, not only due to Frankl's clarity in his writing, but due to the fact that Viktor Frankl was a trained psychiatrist practicing in Austria when the Nazis came for him. This provides an incredible insight into these horrible events. And it gives this book a real unique ring to it. A kind of empathetic viewpoint that allows, to some minute scale, to some tiny degree, the ability of the reader to begin to comprehend what happens to the human mind in that kind of situation. I will never claim any kind of judgment on anybody who lived in that time, because a certain amount of humility must be applied to history. And I'll get back to this later with some of Frankl's own words. But this book is hard to read for obvious reasons. And I will try to convey it as objectively as possible to you, my listener, because I understand that not everybody has the time to deep dive into, this painful literature. I'm going to do my best to bring it to you objectively and highlight a few of the passages which really spoke to me. I will not be able to read all of this book, but if what you hear in this podcast resonates with you as it has with me, I'm going to put a link to the book in the description so you can order it yourself. Read it a few times. It's a book that continues to give. It's separated into two parts. The first part is the autobiographic account of Frankl's survival of the concentration camp system and his observations on human nature therein. The second part of the book are Frankl's own clinical notes. As a psychiatrist, he took many meanings from his experiences, and he obviously felt it very necessary to write those down explicitly. While the second part of this book is incredibly engaging and interesting, I want to focus on the autobiographic part. I only have a few selections, but in my opinion, they are the most poignant. The passage I would like to begin with is found upon page 24. The most painful part of beatings is the insult which they imply. At one time, we had to carry some long, heavy girders over icy tracks. If one man slipped, he endangered not only himself, but all the others who carried the same girder. An old friend of mine had a congenitally dislocated hip. He was glad to be capable of working in spite of it, since the physical disabled were almost certainly sent to death when a selection took place. He limped over the track with an especially heavy girder and seemed about to fall and drag the others with him. As yet, I was not carrying a girder, so I jumped to his assistance without stopping to think. I was immediately hit on the back, rudely reprimanded, and ordered to return to my place. A few minutes previously, the same guard who struck me had told us depreciatingly that we pigs lacked the spirit of comradeship. Another time, in a forest, with the temperature at 2 degrees Fahrenheit, we began to dig up the topsoil, which was frozen hard, in order to lay water pipes. By then, I had grown rather weak physically. Along came a foreman with chubby, rosy cheeks. His face definitely reminded me of a pig's head. I noticed that he wore lovely warm gloves in that bitter cold. For a time, he watched me silently. I felt that trouble was brewing, for in front of me lay the mound of earth, which showed exactly how much I had dug. Then he began. "You pig! I've been watching you the whole time. I'll teach you to work yet. Wait till you dig dirt with your teeth. You'll die like an animal. In 2 days, I'll finish you off. You've never done a stroke of work in your life. What were you, swine? A businessman? I was past caring. But I had to take his threat of killing me seriously. So I straightened up and looked him directly in the eye. I was a doctor, a specialist. What? A doctor? I bet you got a lot of money out of people. As it happens, I did most of my work for no money at all, in clinics for the poor. But now I had said too much. He threw himself on me and knocked me down, shouting like a madman. I can no longer remember what he shouted. I want to show this apparently trivial story that there are moments when indignation can rouse even a seemingly hardened prisoner. Indignation not about cruelty or pain, but the insult connected with it. Moving a little further along in the book. Fortunately, the capo in my working party was obligated to me. He had taken a liking to me because I listened to his love stories and matrimonial troubles, which he poured out during the long marches to our work site. I had made an impression on him with my diagnosis of his character and with my psychotherapeutic advice. After that, he was grateful, and this had already been of value to me. On several previous occasions, he had reserved a place for me next to him in one of the first 5 rows of our detachment, which usually consisted of 280 men. That favor was important. We had to line up early in the morning while it was still dark. Everybody was afraid of being late and having to stand in the back rows. If men were required for an unpleasant and disliked job, the senior capo appeared and usually collected the men he needed from the back rows. These men had to march away to another, especially dreaded kind of work under the command of strange guards. Occasionally the senior capo chose men from the first 5 rows just to catch those who tried to be clever. All protests and entreaties were silenced by a few well-aimed kicks, and the chosen victims were chased to the meeting place with shouts and blows. However, as long as my capo felt the need of pouring out his heart to me, this could not happen to me. I had guaranteed a place of honor next to him. But there was another advantage too. Like nearly all the camp inmates, I was suffering from edema. My legs were so swollen, and the skin on them so tightly stretched, that I could scarcely bend my knees. I had to leave my shoes unlaced in order to make them fit my swollen feet. There would not have been space for socks, even if I had any. So my partly bare feet were always wet, and my shoes always full of snow. This, of course, caused frostbite and chilblains. Every single step became real torture. Clumps of ice formed on our shoes during our marches over snow-covered fields. Over and again men slipped, and those following behind stumbled on top of them. Then the column would stop for a moment, but not for long. One of the guards soon took action and worked over the man with the butt of his rifle to make them get up quickly. The more to the front of the column you were, the less often you were disturbed by having to stop, and then to make up for lost time by running on your painful feet. I was very happy to be the personally appointed physician to His Honor the Capo, and to march in the first row at an even pace. As an additional payment for my services, I could be sure that as long as soup was being dealt out at lunchtime at our work site, he would, when my turn came, dip the ladle right down to the bottom of the vat and fish out a few peas. This capo, a former army officer, even had the courage to whisper to the foreman, whom I had quarreled with, that he knew me to be an unusually good worker. That didn't help matters, but he nevertheless managed to save my life. One of the many times it was saved. The day after the episode with the foreman, he smuggled me into another work party. I think that passage is particularly important. First of all, because of the fact that, as Mr. Frankl says, even a seemingly hardened prisoner can be insulted or feel as though the most painful part of his existence was that insult. And in that passage, Frankl literally risked his life due to a momentary breakdown caused by that. It's not exactly what you would imagine most prisoners to act like. And again, it puts you in that first part of that passage in the mind of a prisoner being beaten for no reason, and then literally in the shoes of a prisoner. And now you can understand why people were always slipping and falling. They didn't even have any socks. They could not lace up their shoes to keep the ice and snow out because they were so swollen from lack of nourishment and the cold and the unbearable conditions. Back to the book. I shall never forget how I was roused one night by the groans of a fellow prisoner who threw himself about in his sleep, obviously having a horrible nightmare. Since I had always been especially sorry for people who suffered from fearful dreams or deliria, I wanted to wake the poor man. Suddenly, I drew back the hand which was ready to shake him, frightened at the thing I was about to do. At that moment, I became intensely conscious of the fact that no dream, no matter how horrible, could be as bad as the reality of the camp which surrounded us, and to which I was about to recall him. Another vignette of prison life in a concentration camp. And I think that brief vignette articulates in a very powerful way the existential nightmare of concentration camp life. Back to the book. There were shouted commands. Detachment. Forward march. Left 2, 3, 4. Left 2, 3, 4. Left 2, 3, 4. Left 2, 3, 4. First man. About. Left and left and left and left. Caps off. These words sound in my ears even now. At the order, caps off, we passed the gate of the camp, and searchlights were trained upon us. Whoever did not march smartly got a kick. And worse off was a man who, because of the cold, had pulled his cap back over his ears before permission was given. We stumbled on in the darkness, over big stones and large enough puddles, along the one road leading from the camp. The accompanying guards kept shouting at us and driving us with the butts of their rifles. Anyone with a very sore feet supported himself on his neighbor's arm. Hardly a word was spoken. The icy wind did not encourage talk. Hiding his mouth behind his upturned collar, the man marching next to me whispered suddenly, "If our wives could see us now, I do hope they are better off in their camps and don't know what is happening to us." That brought thoughts of my own wife to mind. And as we stumbled on for miles, slipping on icy spots, supporting each other time and again, dragging one another up and onward, nothing was said. But we both knew. Each of us was thinking of his wife. Occasionally I looked at the sky, where the stars were fading and the pink light of the morning was beginning to spread behind a dark bank of clouds. But my mind clung to my wife's image, imagining it with an uncanny acuteness. I heard her answering me, saw her smile, her frank and encouraging look. Real or not, her look was more than luminous than the sun which was beginning to rise. A thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it is set into song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. The truth that love is the ultimate and the highest goal to which man can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief had to impart. The salvation of man is through love and in love. I understand how a man who has nothing left in this world still may know the bliss, be it only for a brief moment, in the contemplation of his beloved. That passage made me stop reading this book. And that passage made me pledge to myself to bring this book in some form to you and share the little pieces, the little vignettes of humanity that Viktor Frankl found miraculously in this most inhuman of places. And I think it's so interesting how the camp guards sought to dominate every aspect of the prisoners' lives, to the very simple act of when you can and cannot wear your hat. Your steps are commanded to you. Your hat, and when it is worn, is assigned to you. And time grinds on in an endless deluge of pain. But Frankl writes here on page 37 that he found in that moment, as he thought about his wife amidst all that pain, that love was his calling. And I will say that personally, I've found something very similar. That even in the worst of times, the voices in my head of those I hold closest can lift me up. Although I've never known pain like this, I take his absolute word. Back to the book. This intensification of inner life helped the prisoner find a refuge from the emptiness, desolation, and spiritual poverty of his existence by letting him escape into the past. When given free rein, his imagination played with past events, often not important ones, but minor happenings and trifling things. His nostalgic memory glorified them, and they assumed a strange character. Their world and their existence seemed very distant, and the spirit reached out for them longingly. In my mind, I took bus rides, unlocked the front door of my apartment, answered my telephone, switched on the electric lights. Our thoughts often centered on such details, and those memories could move one to tears. I think that this part of the book is incredibly interesting because I've read 2 other accounts of men who faced incredible periods of time, not only imprisoned, but in almost entire isolation from all other humans. Frankl was always with other prisoners, except for those rare times he was not. But this passage reminded me of Papillon by Henry Chery. Papillon was imprisoned in isolation, solitary confinement for years. A dark cell with no light. He could not talk to anybody. And in his book, he writes about how he took mind trips to his past and relived those memories as vividly as he lived them in the time. Chery wrote that he would cover his head with his pillow from his cot and nearly suffocate himself, forcing himself to enter a twilight of bliss. He attributes this and religious exercise to staying sane, when many others were driven to suicide or absolute madness by the dark isolation of the French penal colonies off the South American coast. Another prisoner account that comes to mind reading this passage comes from the book I'm No Hero by Charlie Plum. Captain Charlie Plum. Plum was shot down over North Vietnam, flying an F-4 Phantom on a massive daylight bombing raid. His aircraft was hit by a missile, and him and his co-pilot were captured in a rice paddy. They were sent to the infamous Hanoi Hilton, and there Mr. Plum endured 6 years of captivity at the hands of the North Vietnamese, who did not treat him as a prisoner of war, but instead treated him as a political prisoner. Charlie Plum remembers vividly a piece of glass in his window that reminded him strikingly of Christ. And he found prayer and solace through the shape of this little piece of glass in his window. And as I read Frankl's account, I can't help but think of this intensification of inner life that helped the prisoner find a refuge from the emptiness. Henry Cherie found his refuge within his memories, as did Charlie Plumb, who often found himself absorbed deep in thought about his past and reliving the smallest details whilst in captivity. So it seems that Viktor Frankl's account has a universality that I have noticed elsewhere in my studies. One of the reasons I believe his account to be so poignant. Back to the book. As the inner life of the prisoner tended to become more intense, he also experienced the beauty of art and nature as never before. Under their influence, he sometimes even forgot his own frightful circumstances. If someone had seen our faces on the journey from Auschwitz to a Bavarian camp as we beheld the mountains of Salzburg with their summits glowing in the sunset, through the little barred windows of the prison carriage, he would never have believed that those were the faces of men who had given up all hope of life and liberty. Despite that factor, or maybe because of it, we were carried away by nature's beauty, which we had missed so very long. I think that that's incredible, and ties back in to the stories I mentioned previously. And I think that that's an interesting point, Frankl writes. Despite that factor, or maybe because of it, we were carried away by nature's beauty, which we had missed for so long. I think that's a case of the proverbial, you don't know what you got till it's gone. Back to the book. Another time, we were at work in a trench. The dawn was gray around us. Gray was the sky above. Gray the snow in the pale light of dawn. Gray the rags in which my fellow prisoners were clad. And gray their faces. I was again conversing silently with my wife. Or perhaps I was struggling to find the reason for my sufferings, my slow dying. In a last violent protest against the hopelessness of imminent death, I sensed my spirit piercing through the enveloping gloom. I felt it transcend that hopeless, meaningless world, and form somewhere I heard a victorious yes in answer to my question of the existence of an ultimate purpose. At that moment, a light was lit in a distant farmhouse, which stood on the horizon as if painted there, in the midst of the miserable gray of a dawning morning in Bavaria. Et lux in tenebris lucet, and the light shineth in the darkness. For hours I stood hacking at the icy ground. The guard passed by, insulting me, and once again I communed with my beloved. More and more I felt that she was present, that she was with me. I had the feeling that I was able to touch her, able to stretch out my hand and grasp hers. The feeling was very strong. She was there. Then, at that very moment, a bird flew down silently and perched just in front of me, on the heap of soil which I had dug up from the ditch and looked steadily at me. I'm not a religious individual, and nor do I believe in higher meanings that man cannot understand. I'm not saying I'm in a place of judgment on these incredibly broad questions. But when I read a passage like that, I can't help but wonder. Because I know Viktor Frankl has no reason to lie. Back to the book. It also follows that a very trifling thing can cause the greatest of joys. Take as an example something that happened on our journey from Auschwitz to the camp affiliated with Dachau. We had all been afraid that our transport was heading for the Mauthausen camp. We became more and more tense as we approached a certain bridge over the Danube, which the train would have to cross to reach Mauthausen. According to the statement of experienced traveling companions, those who had never seen anything similar cannot possibly imagine the dance of joy performed in our carriage by the prisoners when they saw that our transport was not crossing the bridge and was instead heading only for Dachau. Frankl put the term "only" in that last sentence within quotes. Instead, heading only for Dachau. Again, that life or death juxtaposition is startling, especially in this peaceful life most of us lead, surrounded by comfort to the point that we are uncomfortable. Here, men dance with joy because they're heading to Dachau. Because Dachau is the better of the options. Sitting with that thought is nearly impossible for a person like me who has lived the life I had of comfort. I've never seen a dead body. By this point, Viktor Frankl had seen countless, I'm sure. But reading this book, as I've said before, I feel as though despite my sheltered life, I'm able to briefly, minutely begin to understand the level of life or death dichotomy that exists here. Back to the book. In other work parties, the foreman maintained an apparently local tradition of dealing out numerous blows, which made us talk of the relative luck of not being under their command, or perhaps of being under it only temporarily. Once by an unlucky chance, I got into such a group. If an air raid alarm had not interrupted us after 2 hours, during which time the foreman had worked on me specially, making it necessary to regroup the workers afterwards, I think that I would have returned to camp on one of the sledges which carried those who had died or were dying from exhaustion. No one can imagine the relief that the siren can bring in such a situation. not even a boxer who has heard the bell signifying the finish of a round, and who is thus saved at the last minute from the danger of a knockout. The last part of this book that I would like to share with you is a part that I find incredibly important to remember in all aspects of history. I remember a professor I once had, one of my favorite professors. He had a way of articulating ancient Greek history in a way that made it seem like it was not figments of an ancient fairy tale, acting out bizarre, archaic acts, disconnected from our own humanity. My favorite professor would always tie ancient historical events back to modern day instances. And his constant point, even when we studied pre-Bronze Age cultures, was that these humans were no less complex than us today. While it's true they lacked the technology and the cultural similarities that we enjoy and recognize today, they were people too. People with emotions, people with flaws, people living their lives for themselves and their family. And when you read history through that lens of these are not inhuman figments of the past, but perfectly human, relatable individuals, as a historian, the world of empathy is open to you, and you begin to truly understand why people did what they did, even if you'll never know the full picture. I fear that I'm rambling, but I am leaving this book on an incredibly humble note from Frankl. Frankl writes, "But it is not for me to pass judgment on those prisoners who put their own people above everyone else. Who can throw a stone at a man who favors his friends under circumstances when sooner or later it is a question of life or death? No man should judge unless he asks himself in absolute honesty whether in a similar situation he might not have done the same." And I'm sure Viktor Frankl, on some level, would have liked to have found comfort in blaming others through judgment. But instead, he does an incredibly responsible and humble thing by taking it upon himself to say, who is he to judge others? And I think that if Frankl, who lived these incredibly horrific events, himself says that he cannot judge, then I know that I, sitting here comfortably, shall not judge the participants of the past. It is my goal to preserve these memories, in hopes so that people will never forget. And in turn, in a hope that it will not happen again. This has been episode 1 of the Modern Military History Podcast with your host, Andy. I plan on making a podcast every week, and I want to release it every Wednesday. Next Wednesday, I want to bring to you Ordinary Men, which is an incredibly uncomfortable but academic historical look at the other side of the Holocaust. Because, as Frankl says, we shall not judge. And as I say, all aspects of this horrific history must be remembered, so that it must not be repeated again. Thank you, and good night.